Malachi chapter 2, verses 5 through 9. Quick recap of what we've been going through. We went through the book of Malachi chapter 1 pretty quickly. And basically this is the end of the Old Testament as we know it. And it's just to give you all the background, it's ushering in this New Testament, this idea that the priesthood has failed. You know, not that the covenant has failed, but the people of God have failed to live up to this covenant, and that there's something lacking. And this is going to be that last prophecy promising that someone like Elijah is going to come, and that God is going to send someone who is going to be able to help them fulfill this covenant properly. So two things I hope we've been learning as we've been going through the book of Malachi. I know it's a little difficult. It's difficult for me to prepare for. Is that God rejects sacrifice and service that is from a corrupted heart. And even today, we struggle with this salvation and not understanding that it's not enough to just say the words, not enough to just attend church. But if your heart's not really in it, if you're not really, if it's not a sacrifice of genuine love of God, if it's not a service from a genuine love of God, God really does not want it. He doesn't want your money. He doesn't want your servant if it's not of love of him. And it's just something that pervades this book of Malachi and also pervades most of the Old Testament, where they're acting out what he's commanded them to do without actually doing it. They're performing it to a level of religiousness that would make us feel ashamed, but their heart's not in it. And God is saying, I've rejected that completely. All 1,000 years of history, he's like, I've rejected all of that because you didn't do it from a good heart. Second point that I hope that you guys are getting from this is that although the Levites claim the title of priests, they fail to live up to God's standards. And I think God singles them out because they are supposed to be his representative. And much of what we're going to talk about today is going to be focused on this Levitical priesthood, on this, why is God singling them out? And why is this indictment of them an indictment of us today and an indictment of man altogether? And why does it cry out for a Savior? Why does it shine the light on Christ and the need for Christ? All right? Does anyone have any questions about what we've done so far? Good. All right, I did a good job there. I'm going to read verses 5. Well, I'm going to read from verse 4 through 9, just because I had stopped abruptly, just because I wanted to focus a lot on, I wanted to explain who Levi was and what it says going. So I'll read this from verse 4 on. From verse 3, Behold, I will corrupt your seed and spread dung upon your faces, even the dung of your solemn feasts, and one shall take you away with it. And you shall know that I have sent this commandment unto you, that my covenant might be with Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. My covenant, now we're going to begin where we're starting today. My covenant was with him of life and peace, and I gave them to him for the fear wherewith he feared me, and was afraid before my name. The law of truth was in his mouth, and iniquity was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity, and did turn many away from iniquity. For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. But ye are departed out of the way, you have caused many to stumble at the law. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore have I also made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as ye have not kept my ways, but have been partial in the law. So I have a question before we get too deep into this. Like, who has difficulty reading, studying through the Old Testament? All right, I see a lot of hands. Okay. It's very difficult, I think, to read through this without, you kind of have to read the whole thing. You kind of have to immerse yourself into the culture, the Jewish culture, to really immerse yourself in understanding what God is trying to say to you for you to really understand the Old Testament. And I know I kind of went through chapter 1 and the first 4 verses of chapter 2 very quickly without kind of maybe explaining some of the things about who Levi is, what's happening at this point in the scripture. And I want to spend a little time explaining to you who Levi is. What is a Levitical priesthood? Why is this such a heinous thing beyond the fact that they're priests and, in the modern times, priests are the servants of God. But it went deeper than that. There was a covenant that's mentioned in these verses. And it was a little difficult for me because I'm thinking the covenant is the law, the law of Moses. And I'm sure it can apply to that, but it's a deeper covenant that God made with the people of Levi. And I want you to kind of walk with me through some of the Old Testament stories in Genesis and Exodus to try to make sense of this. All right? So I had a couple questions that I wanted to deal with, hoping that this will kind of make Malachi open up to you and more understanding. For the first question is, verse 5, I'll read it again. My covenant was with him, right? Levi. My covenant was with Levi of life and peace. And I gave to them, the Levites, the Levitical priesthood, the people from that line, for fear wherewith he feared me and was afraid before my name. And this verse was really difficult for me because who's he talking about? What is it, who is this referring to? Now, who is Levi? Does anyone know who Levi is? And what's this covenant? What's going on with it? But primarily, who is Levi? Does anyone know? Mike?
He was one of the 12 children of Israel.
Mm-hmm. And from your memory, do you remember that covenant with Levi at any point?
Yeah, it was of his tribe that was sort of set apart to do the sacred work of the priest.
Good. Yeah, good answer. We're going to kind of go through it. But yeah, so when like I said in chapter 1, when he talks about Edom and Esau, which Edom and Esau are the same thing, when he talks about Jacob, it's his understanding that he sees the fathers and the descendants as being kind of one thing in God's eyes. So when he says Levi, honestly, some of the things that happened had nothing to do with Levi, right? So maybe I'm going to start off by showing, exactly what Mike said. He was 100% correct. Who Levi is and why it's not really talking about Levi, all right? If you guys want to turn, Genesis 49, verses 5 through 7. I think we're going to have to kind of go through Genesis, through Exodus to kind of really understand why this is such a heinous thing that's going on. And maybe it could make more sense to how it applies to us today. Genesis 49, verses 5 through 7. And I'll read. Simeon, let me give a little context. So this is the point of where Jacob is dying. He's giving his last blessing. He's kind of extolling. He's going to bless Judah. There's a big passage that comes after that where he's kind of blessing Judah and saying, the leadership will not pass from Judah. He's a lion's whelp, and it's kind of a prophecy of Christ coming. But before that, it's kind of like not a real blessing, right? He's talking about the first, about Simeon and Levi. So I'll read it. Simeon and Levi are brethren. Instruments of cruelty are there in their habitations. O my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly, mine honor. Be not thou united, for in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. And reading it, we're going to learn more about how the Levites were scattered. They didn't have their own home. They kind of were meant to be living in the different places of all the other tribes. But that's just an aside. It's just interesting to me. The point of this is they don't really get a blessing. Like Jacob is looking back and saying, you guys were cruel. You guys were really bad. Like he's alluding to bad things that they do. But in the verses that we're dealing with here, in Malachi, God is commending Levi and saying, Levi feared me. Like I made a covenant with him. Like as if Levi was someone that we should look up to and say, okay, that's the standard and you guys are breaking it. So obviously he's not talking about Levi in terms of the physical Levi, the son of I think it was the third son of Jacob. He's not talking about that Levi. He's talking about his descendants. I wanted to go to Genesis 34, 25, 31 to kind of show you that it's not him. It's not that Levi. It's not that person that we're supposed to be identifying. Maybe someone else can read that. Genesis, no, it's so long. I'll read it. Genesis 34, 25 to 31. And the context of this also is that they had a sister Dinah, and they were amongst the inhabitants of the land, and one of the people in the land took advantage of keep it PG, this is a family church, took advantage of of their sister Dina. And they came, and the guy who did it said, I was wrong, but I really love her. I want to marry her. I want to make this right. All right? There's no way to make that right, but he felt like at least I would marry her and she would not be shamed. And the brother said, great, okay, let's have an agreement, let's do that, let's marry her, at least that's not bad. And then and you think, oh, they're doing something good, but this is what they actually do. Genesis 34, 25 to 31, here we go. And so they tell them, okay, we'll have a party, we'll get married, but get circumcised. And if anyone knows, getting circumcised as an adult, it's very, very painful for a man, and they're kind of knocked out after that. 25. And it came to pass on the third day, when they were sore, that the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brethren, took each man his sword, and came upon the city boldly, and slew all the males. And they slew Hamor and Shechem, his son, with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah out of Shechem's house, and went out. The sons of Jacob came upon the slain, and spoiled the city, because they had defiled their sister. They took their sheep and their oxen and their asses, and that which was in the city, and that which was in the field, and all their wealth, and all their little ones, and their wives took they captive, and spoiled even all that was in the house. And Jacob said to Simeon and Levi, Ye have troubled me to make me to stink among the inhabitants of Canaan, among the Canaanites and the Perizzites. And I, being few in number, they shall gather themselves to destroy me, and slay me, and I shall be destroyed, I and my house. And they said, Should he deal with our sister as with an harlot? So, it's not talking about that Levi, because if that's what God is talking about in terms of living in life and peace, I don't think that's what he's applying to. But you can read these verses and kind of get a little confused about who he's referring to. But he's talking about the descendants of Levi, in which he made a covenant with. All right? Does that make sense, everyone? All right? So God sometimes will refer to one of the sons of Jacob, but he's actually meaning this descendants of the sons of Jacob. All right? So another thing, if it's not the physical Levi, which one is he talking about? Well, who do you think it is? Right? Because he's talking about a specific person who embodies what the Levitical priesthood, the descendants, should be following. So it is a person. I agree with you, Mike, that it is the Levitical priesthood, but he is referring to a person or persons. Because he's saying, you can look to that time and say, this is what I really want you to be. So who do you think Levi is referring to in this particular place? Who do you think God made a covenant with?
The priest.
The priest.
The high priest.
The high priest. And
the priesthood.
Right? But I believe that he's talking about a specific, he's saying there's an ideal for which I want you to look back to, and you guys are not living up to that. Names. Throw some names out. Well, a living person. A person who they knew of at the time.
Aaron.
There we go, Aaron. Anyone else? So, I believe he's talking about Aaron, but not only Aaron, but he's also talking about Moses. Do you know who Aaron is?
Moses' brother.
Moses' brother. He was the first high priest. He was the one who does a lot of in Exodus, he's the one that did a lot of the performing and everything. And I'm actually going to go through all the things that he did. I didn't realize that he was so involved in the whole process. But I think it's referring not only to Aaron, because Aaron did a lot of bad things too, but I think he's talking about Moses. Why do you think I'm thinking it's talking about Moses? I don't think a lot of people realize that he's also talking about Moses as well as Aaron. Because Moses was also a son of Levi. He was also a descendant of Levi. All right? And this covenant, which when you think of covenant, you're going to think the covenant of Mount Sinai, the law. But it was given to Moses. Moses then anointed Aaron. And it was kind of like a joint process where they did things together throughout that whole process. So when I think God is saying with him life and peace, I think he's talking about Aaron and Moses. And he's kind of combining them. And he's saying those were the examples that you should have followed. They gave you the law. They demonstrated how to operate in the law. And you are doing the opposite of that. And if you notice on this paper, there's a chart showing you how God's ideal and the priest's corruption. And I think God is letting us know that there's something that you can see in the book to show you what I mean. Because most of the Bible is showing you how we fail, right? But he's saying, yes, there was an example for you to follow, so you can't say you don't know what I'm talking about. And we in the New Testament have the example of Christ to follow, so you know exactly what he means when he says to be godly and holy and not to sin. Does that make sense? All right? Good. So, it's not talking about Levi, the son of Jacob. He's talking about, in my opinion, and I hope it bears out the scripture. I'm going to show you that he's talking about Moses and Levi, or even more specifically Levi, but in that they're
Levi
combined.
Huh? Levi or Aaron?
Aaron. I'm sorry, Aaron and Moses. I'm sorry. So one text I wanted to go through to kind of show you this. I know I'm probably belaboring it, but I want you guys to really understand that God had a pattern. He had something that they wanted to follow. They knew this. It wasn't a mystery like it may be a mystery to us. When he's referring to this, they know what he means. Right? Exodus chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. Maybe someone else can read that. I'll pick somebody.
And the anger, it's 14 to 16, right?
Yep.
And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, Is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee, and when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. And thou shalt speak unto him, and put words in his mouth, and I will be with thy mouth, and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do. And he shall be thy spokesman unto the people, and he shall be, even he shall be to thee instead of a mouth, and thou shalt be to him instead of God.
Let's stop there. Okay, thank you. And so here, hopefully everyone knows the story about how Moses goes to the burning bush, and God is telling him, I want you to free my people. And you think Moses is going to be like, all right, I'm going to do this to God. God's talking from a bush. I'm excited. I have all the signs I need. I have God of the universe behind me to do this. And he starts telling God all the reasons why he can't do it. I don't really speak well. I'm shy. They have no reason to follow me. They don't know me. I ran away from Egypt for this particular reason because I was trying to help my fellow citizens, brethren, and they did not respect me. So me going back after 80 years, when they knew me as Pharaoh's son, and when they knew me as someone who fled, they're not going to respect me. And he's just telling God all the things he can't do. And God's getting it says God is angered by this, and then he just offers up Aaron. He said, your brother's going to come. He's a good speaker. People respect him. Okay, he's going to go along with you, and he's going to speak for you because you're afraid, and he's going to help you do the miracles because you're afraid. All right? And that I'm trying to establish a pattern to show you that it was Moses and Aaron doing all these things together. Yes?
It'd be helpful for everyone here if they read Hebrews chapter 7. We see a change in the law, a change in the priesthood. We see Levi in the loins of Abraham. Abraham was before. We see that priesthood, and chapter 7 goes into Levi, if they want to read that, the next day or whatever, as far as Levi and Abraham and Melchizedek, and the change in the priesthood that takes place, what the law wouldn't do, weaken through the flesh, Jesus, and the change in not only in the law, but a change in the priesthood, where the high priest is Jesus Christ.
Correct. And I'm going to try to deal with that a little later as we go through Malachi, because it's setting that whole thing up. But I think a principle that he's talking about in Hebrews 7 is this idea that he's in the loins, that the Levitical priesthood is tied to Abraham, it's tied to Levi, and it's tied to his descendants. And that's kind of what is good for us, because we're not tied to that. We are connected to the great high priest, Jesus Christ. So I just wanted to go through a couple patterns with you, and I'm going to maybe do it a little quickly to show you Aaron. For example, the next one is Exodus 4:29 through 30. And I don't know if you realize it, but Aaron wasn't only speaking for Moses, he sometimes was the one who was demonstrating. He was the one holding the rod up. He was the one actually, Moses was doing it, but he was the one who everyone saw performing the miracles. So when God is saying, I have this example that you have seen, it's Aaron and Moses performing and having faith in God and being more fearful of God than of Pharaoh. And so the priests of that time who knew the law and who knew the scriptures would know what God is talking about. We may not know what God is talking about. We may not be trying to be confused and trying to identify who is he talking about. They knew exactly who it was. So, for example, Exodus chapter 4, verses 29 through 30 says, "And Moses and Aaron went and gathered all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken unto Moses." Okay, what? Not Moses, right? God either said to Moses and Aaron together, or he told Moses and then Moses told Aaron, and then Aaron told the people. Like, I want you to really understand that's what's happening. You can read it real quick and miss that. "And Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken unto Moses, and did the signs in the sight of the people." He didn't just go up there and talk and then step back, and Moses did. He was so fearful that sometimes the miracle would happen and it would look like Aaron's the one doing it. But Moses, everyone knew it was Moses, but Aaron was the showman. He was the one who stood up there and demonstrated it. Right? So I want you to keep that in mind. I want you to, like, when you're reading the Old Testament, not just read through it real quick. It's a story. There's a lot of stuff going on. I want you to read through it and kind of see how God is working through this process. And then in that relationship, God is showing you how you're supposed to operate with him. Read his word. He tells you what the right thing is to do, and then you act it out. Right? This idea that don't be fearful. Don't be afraid. God asks you to do something, he's going to be with you in the process of doing it. Right? And even the verse that we read before, it talks about how God says he's going to be your spokesman. Right? He's going to be a mouth to you, and you're going to be as a God, lowercase God, obviously, right? And he's trying to show this relationship, and this was supposed to teach them, this is how it works. This is what a priest should be, right? It's going to talk about later how he's the messenger of the Lord of hosts, that's your job. And we go into 1 Peter, and we go to the New Testament, and we are priests. And words that we speak and the way that we represent ourselves is representing Christ. Because the only thing most people are going to see of God is us. Or of Jesus Christ, or know of Christ, is us.
It's Peter 2:9. We are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, that we should show forth the praises of him who called us out of darkness into his marvelous lightness, who at one time were not a people, but now are the people of God.
You should say it again. One more time. Just say it one more time. You say it one more time. It's really good. I love that verse. Those verses. All right, we're going to jump to another Exodus chapter 7. I can show you a lot more. I'm just kind of show you this pattern to let you understand what's happening. Exodus chapter 7, verses 1 through 2.
And the Lord said to Moses, "See, I make you as God to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet. You shall speak all that I command you, and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh, that he let the sons of Israel go out from his land."
Once again, the Lord is telling Moses. Moses tells Aaron. Aaron does it. And you're going to also notice this pattern where even when Pharaoh calls them, he calls Aaron and Moses. He doesn't call them separately because they're always together. He's like, call Aaron and call Moses. Tell them they both come. Right? And in some respects, it says Moses sometimes speaks directly and sometimes Aaron speaks. And there's this combination going as God is building up Moses' courage. And Aaron is acting for him as a priest. And I also think it's preparing Aaron for when he really becomes the high priest. He's used to this process of listening to God and doing what God says. This is this humility, this symbiosis, this relationship that's supposed to be going on that the priests of this time are not doing. That the priests, ever since that point on, have not been doing. And it's supposed to embarrass them. It's supposed to show them how far they are below God. Right? And it's supposed to have them cry out for help, which we get from Christ, if that makes any sense. Another, Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 through 18. Once again, just showing you that it's happening throughout. I could have shown you a lot more verses, but it's a constant process. Exodus chapter 8, verses 16 through 18. So I'm going to read that.
Then the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the earth, so that it may become gnats in the land of Egypt. And they did so. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff and struck the dust of the earth, and there were gnats on the man and beast. All the dust of the earth became gnats in all the land of Egypt. The magicians tried by their secret arts to produce gnats, but they could not. So there were gnats on man and beast.
Yeah, so I was surprised. I was like, I'm reading this and I'm going through it, trying to prepare for this. It doesn't say Moses did. It doesn't say Moses told them and then Moses did it. It said Moses told Aaron and Aaron did it. Right? So I'm telling you that I really truly believe verse 5, verse 4, verse 6 through 9 is referring to this Moses-Aaron combination. And so when God is talking about, you have an example of the Levitical priesthood, you have an example of what I want, that's what we're supposed to be looking at. And if we want to know what it means to be good priests, is this idea of Aaron and Moses, right? This is what God is talking about. So Aaron is not only speaking for Moses, which a lot of people knew, he's also performing the miracles for Moses. He's helping, he's a true brother to him, all right? And God rewards him by making him the head priest, all right? And now, so we kind of have an understanding who God is referring to when he refers to Levi. Yes, in general, he's talking about the Levitical priesthood. He's talking about all the descendants of Levi who are in that priesthood. But specifically in these verses, he's talking about Aaron and Moses. Or pick your pick. Aaron doing what Moses has told him to do, or Moses, because he's the son of Levi, exemplifying this love of God, this humility towards God. And now, the next thing I want to, does everyone understand that? I know it's probably really simple, but I want you guys to beat it over your head.
My thing basically is to bring brought out is that they also have two separate offices. Like
Correct.
When you see in the Holy Holies, when you go into Hebrews 9, well, that high priest later on went in one time, and he was the only one that could go in at that time. That was the great high priest once a year on Yom Kippur, right?
Exactly. And I could have talked about how this prophet, priest, king. And in this case, there was no king, right? We've been going through Judges, and God and Pastor Peter's telling you about everyone was doing what was in his own sight, right? This kingly part came in David's time because because the priests were failing. They didn't want to have prophecy. They wanted to be delivered. They wanted someone to just tell them what to do so they can be like the other people. And so this is also teaching us about the prophet priest. This God is using a prophet and a priest throughout history, and then he has a prophet, priest, and king, and then Christ comes and embodies all of that, right? God is kind of like teaching them through life, through all these things that are happening, what they really need, right? Because they think they don't need a prophet, but they need a prophet.
In Hebrews 4, seeing that we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, and Jesus Christ, the author and the finisher of the faith, and that's it.
Good.
Not like the Catholic Church, right, brother?
Yeah, exactly. And so the next thing is that I want you guys to think about, because it refers to my covenant, right? And I think later on, verse 8, it says, you have corrupted the covenant of Levi. And so I initially, when I was doing the study, trying to prepare, was thinking of the law of Moses, right? The Ten Commandments, the ceremonial laws, the legal laws. And I do believe he's talking about that to some extent, but I also think he's talking about the specific covenant that he had with the tribe of Levi. The specific covenant that occurred at the time and was embedded in the law of Moses, right? And can someone, well, I guess I'll read it. Well, someone read Numbers 3, 1 through 5, and someone read 6 to 10. That'll be helpful, I think. To kind of show you what the covenant I think God is talking about. It's very important. And if it was just a general covenant, that general law, I think it would still have the same force. But because it's this particular covenant, it's even more embarrassing. It's indicative not only of the priest, but the people. Right? God is speaking about the priest, not just to pick on them, but because it represents the entire fabric of the Jewish community, the entire fabric of the whole relationship of religious community. They are supposed to be the first. Who wants to read Numbers 3, 1 through 5?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
These are the generations of Aaron and Moses at the time when the Lord spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai. These are the names of the sons of Aaron: Nadab the firstborn, and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These are the names of the sons of Aaron, the anointed priests, whom he ordained to serve as priests. But Nadab and Abihu died before the Lord when they offered unauthorized fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai. And they had no children, so Eleazar and Ithamar served as priests in the lifetime of Aaron their father. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying,
All right, someone read 6 through 10. Thank you.
Bring the child of Levi near, and set them before Aaron the priest, that they may minister to him. They shall keep guard over him and over the whole congregation before the tent of the meeting, as they minister at the tabernacle. They shall guard all the furnishings of the tent of meeting, and keep guard over the people of Israel, as they minister at the tabernacle. And you shall give the Levites to Aaron and his sons. They are wholly given to him from among the people of Israel. And you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall guard their priesthood. But if any outsider comes near, he shall be put to death.
Oh, well, I should have kept on going. I'll read some of it. I'm sorry. And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, this is verse 11 continuing, and I behold, I have taken the Levites from among the children of Israel, instead of all the firstborn that opened the matrix among the children of Israel, before the Levites shall be mine, because all the firstborn are mine. For on the day that I smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I hallowed unto me all the firstborn of Israel, both man and beast. Mine shall they be. I am the Lord. Read it one more time. And verse 12. And I, behold, have taken the Levites, right, from among the children of Israel, instead of all the firstborn that open the matrix, all the firstborn that are born, among the children of Israel, therefore the Levites shall be mine, because all the firstborn are mine. For on the day that I smote all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, I hallowed unto me all the firstborn in Israel, both man and beast. Mine shall they be. I am the Lord. So what is he talking about? What's this event that happened? I want to see who's reading their Bible from the Old Testament on. Right? What happened? What is he talking about? What is God talking about? The firstborn and their mine. What's going on here?
This is from the angel of death, right? The Passover.
So God, exactly. So God killed the Egyptians, the firstborn of all the Egyptians, but there's a cost. God doesn't just do anything in a vacuum. There's a cost. And he says, I spared your firstborn. So there's a price. There's a debt, right? Where do we see this kind of give and get in New Testament? The cross, right? Exactly. So I want you guys to read it like this. Read the Old Testament and think about it in this way. This was not just for this. God is thinking about all time. And he's saying the price to save you was the firstborn of Egypt. But I don't work that way, right? You have to pay the cost too. It can't be just them, right? So we can't, through our good works, just work really, really hard, and then God's going to save us. Like he wants everything. Something has to die, right? And in this case, he says, I gave it to you freely. I freed you. There was a cost for it, and you have to pay the cost. And so the Levites, who in this time are acting all high and mighty and breaking all of God's laws and not doing what he says, and we can go back through Malachi 1 and he starts like listing all the things that they're doing wrong. This is heinous. It's like someone saved you, clothed you, fed you, gave you money, and then you're going around bad talking them. Like it's crazy to think that God saved all of the people of Israel, killed a whole swath of another group of people, then said, by rights, I should require your firstborn as well. That should be the cost. But instead of that, I'm going to take one tribe away, and their punishment is that they're going to serve me. They're going to be fed from the tithes and everything that everyone else gives because they're worshiping me. They're going to minister, and they're going to be a protection from all the plagues and the diseases and everything that's happening around everyone else, that's touching everyone else. They're going to be a protection for you. So instead of punishing them, he blessed them. And so it's not a burden, but they're acting like it's a burden. So the Levitical priesthood, this covenant he's talking about, he said, I want you to remember that I saved you at a cost. And the requirement was that you would be holy unto me, that you would be true priests, that you would be like Aaron and Moses. But you're not behaving that way. And you should be ashamed, because this covenant is the crux of the law. This agreement that we have together, that you're going to be separated unto me, is fundamental to everything that we believe as Christians and they believed as Jews. It's the same as today people who claim to be Christians living a sinful, wanton life because they're basically cursing God. They're taking God's Jesus' payment on the cross for granted, and they're just kind of spitting on it. It's the same thing. So when you're reading Malachi, you should have the same conviction and the same anger at these priests for what's going on. Yes?
When you were saying, with the firstborn and with the cross, that as far as with the covenant, that everyone should be aware that God cuts the covenant, that the covenant is unilateral. And when you were saying with the cross and with the firstborn, I think of that we know that all things work together for good to them who love God, who are the called according to his purpose. And it's saying that he is the firstborn among many brethren, and that he did not spare his own son, but delivered him up for us all. Where did he deliver him up? Where?
Of course.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. He is the firstborn.
Correct.
Among
Amen.
many
I was
brethren.
going to ask that question, yeah.
And then we follow, and that's what takes place there. So, a lot of people are confused that I speak to in other churches on Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 17. They say that covenant is God and man on what we do. No, God cut that whole covenant in Genesis 12 with the animals, and then he steamrolled through there with God. That it's 100%, in my understanding, it's all unilateral.
Right. And thank you. And just for you guys to understand, yes, there's this anger at them, and this is disappointment that the priest would not live up to it, but it's also indicative of the fact that you can't live up to it. Yeah. That's the point. So you're reading this, and you're angry, and you're like, what's going on? This is like, they're supposed to be priests. Just like today when we see these false preachers, I know we have this anger, and we're like, why would they say these things? Why would you disrespect God in this way? But it's without the Spirit of Christ, without God, without him changing us, none of us can fulfill it, right? That's what the book of Malachi is trying to belabor. So when you're reading it, and you're reading a lot of the Old Testament, it's not just a story. Or you got to find out deeper about the story, and it's still about Christ. The Bible, Christ said that it all talks about me. Read the scriptures because it tells of me.
Luke 24.
Right? So, amen. So the firstborn, this covenant, is the same kind of covenant we have with Christ. He's the firstborn of many sons, right? It's the idea that he is he's risen, and we're going to rise with him. So that's kind of it. So this covenant, my covenant was with him of life and peace. I'm thinking he's talking about this particular person or persons, right? Aaron and Moses. And he gave it to them because they feared him. Moses feared him. Moses and Aaron feared him. They feared him more than they feared the Pharaoh. They did it. Even though they were a little scared, even though they balked, they did it. They went and did what we wouldn't even do. We don't even go out of evangelize. We don't want to talk to our coworkers. We don't want to do it. Like they went before the ruler, the most powerful ruler of that time. And they said, this is what God has required.
See, what you just said is very good. When you said that he rise, we rise. See, what's true of Christ is true of us. When he died, I died. When he was risen, I was risen. And it's very hard to understand this, but you just have to go to Romans 6:6, knowing this, that the old man was crucified, that the body of sin might be destroyed. So when Christ died, I died. It's great to know this, right, Pastor? But it's assurance. Yeah. He said it, Glenn. Yeah. He was raised we were raised. You go to Ephesians 2:1 and you see that.
Exactly. Any questions? Try to make it as simple as possible. Any questions? And I mean, reread Leviticus, reread Numbers, reread Exodus, and you're going to see this beautiful tapestry. And I'm like, don't just skip. That's why I kind of read through chapter 3. Don't just skip the names. It's very important, right? In that little part that we read, it also talked about that there was Aaron, then he had sons, and they didn't go to the firstborn son to be the high priest. Why? Because the other ones died, because they offered strange fire. They offered this strange fire before God. God rejected them, right? Everything in there is indicative of Christ and about what it means to be a Christian and what it means to be in God's sight. You don't just get in there because of blood. You don't just get in there because you do the rituals, right? And the way that they behaved, the way that they offered that strange fire, indicated that they really were not a part of the kingdom of God. And God just completely skipped them. He didn't keep going. And this is stuff that the priests knew, and yet they still profaned God. They still did the opposite of what God required. They still did not pursue this from a pure heart, right? And I think we're all guilty of that, and I know I'm guilty of that. And I want you guys to read it. Do not read the Bible as if it's talking about somebody else. Do not read the Bible as if it's about someone else. It's about you. And so when I read this, it's like on me. And that's what I want you guys to get from this. All right. We're going to go through verses 6 through 9. It's a lot of stuff, and I'm not going to be able to cover all of it, so I'm going to kind of truncated it. I'll read most of it again so you guys can get the context. So he talks about verse 4, about Levi. He talks about his covenant, and then he starts breaking down what he expected and what they actually were doing. The law of truth was in his mouth, Levi again, whoever it's referring to. And iniquity or lawlessness was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and equity. Once again, this peace and equity, this, if you follow me, this is what your life is going to be about, right? And did turn many away from iniquity, that the good conduct, the pure heart saved many. Stopped people from doing a lot of lawlessness as well. For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts. Once again, just talking about what a priest is. But ye are departed out of the way. They're not acting like priests. Ye have caused many to stumble at the law. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, that covenant we just talked about, saith the Lord of hosts. Therefore I've also made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as ye have not kept my ways, but have been partial in the law. All right? Before I get into it, I want to ask you guys some questions. So we're all familiar with the false preachers out there. We've all been inundated with false sermons, and hearing all the things about bad pastors. Do you guys have any experiences, any stories? Like what are the dangers of a false preacher? What's the danger of someone who claims to be a man of God or a woman of God or a preacher, and then they do something that detracts from that? Yes, Jack.
They're actually leading people to sin?
Yes.
Instead of away from it?
Yes. Yes. Anything else? Anything else is good. Yes.
Believing a false gospel.
Right. So they think they are following God. They're not. They're leading them away. They're causing them to sin, actually, in a way. Anything else? Yes. Ben.
Yeah, it creates a false view of who God is.
Yeah. Yeah. So someone who's truly trying to seek is going to get a bad image. I know a lot of people who are like, oh, I don't go because of this, or that pastor, or this church that I went to, and it's like, well, that has nothing to do with it. But they don't know that. All they know is what's represented to them. And if I'm going by and I hear a church and the guy's screaming for money, I'm going to think that's what a pastor is for, is to get money. Or he's only about wealth, or he's like a miracle worker that's supposed to do stuff for me. All right? Anything else?
False assurance.
False assurance. People believe they're saved and they're really not. Right? I was told like 100,000 times, say this prayer and you're in. And I don't know if I was in at that time. Yeah.
Today, at the conference that we were at, it's quintessential doctrinal preaching and expository preaching. And if you don't have these doctrines down, it's really sad because you'll never be able to do the imperatives. You'll never be able to do the practical. And I turn
Tell them
on.
what imperatives are.
The imperatives would be
Demands.
what you would do, the practical, such as you have to have an understanding of the doctrines in order to do that. Like maybe the Lord willing, the pastor will be doing Ephesians. You go to Ephesians 1, 2, 3, that's all doctrinal. When you go to 4, 5, it's saying put off the old man, put on the old, the new.
Yeah.
You cannot do that unless you basically are undergirded by doctrinals, you see. And a lot of people will say to me on the street, well, doctrine's boring. And basically, then I only want to do the practical. Well, how are you going to do it?
Exactly. Thank you.
This week's memory verse is an imperative.
You gonna read it like this in memory or?
I don't have it down yet. I don't
Okay.
have it down yet. But I do know it's an imperative.
All right. I know Phil's really mad if he's watching this right now. That everyone doesn't know it all automatically.
Well, the next verse is be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted,
Wait,
forgiving
did you
one
say the
another.
next verse?
The next verse after the one that's supposed to be memorized this time is be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as Christ has forgiven you.
That's how you do it.
That's also an imperative, by the way.
Oh, amen. Yeah.
It's a double imperative.
So would you all agree that it's very destructive? It's not good, right? So I want you guys to understand why God is focusing on them. It's not just the rest of the people are doing all right and the priests are doing good. He's saying if you guys are doing this, that means the rest of the people are not doing right. If all this stuff is not going the way that I commanded you to do it, everyone's a mess. So this is really saying the world at that time is a mess. All these Jewish people who think they're in God's sight are a mess. Yeah, they're scattered, one or two, but as a whole, you guys are nowhere near where you're supposed to be. That's what you're supposed to get from this, right? So God, I kind of charted it out to try to make it simple. God's ideal, the character that he wants from his priests, which, if you know about the New Testament, is also what he wanted from the regular people, right? But they were supposed to exemplify it, was that the law of truth would be found in his mouth. They're constantly talking about the law of God. They're constantly talking about the gospel, as we should be doing. Every scripture is dripping from them, right? Everything is about scripture. Everything is about that. When I first was saved, I had a friend who was supposed to be a Christian, and she was like, "You're talking too much like the Bible." Like, she was like, "You're talking funny." But I was trying to represent, whatever I read, I was repeating it. I was talking in the same way I heard the Bible, the same love I heard from the Bible. And she thought, this is so strange. You're just talking weird. You know, but that's what God wants. He doesn't want you to speak the language of this time. He wants you to speak what he's saying, right? Love, grace, mercy, all these kind of things are what you're supposed to be representing. And they were supposed to exemplify that. People are going to these priests for help. And if they're offering anything other than the law of truth, it's a problem, right? That's in verse 6. Verse 6, he said there was no iniquity found in his lips. No lawlessness found in his lips, right? He was talking the law of truth, the covenant, whatever Bible said, but he was also not, when he was not saying specific scripture and everything else, he was also not telling people to do what the opposite of what the Bible was saying, right? That's what we should do. That's what God requires of us, right? Verse 7, the lips should keep knowledge, or it says, for the priest's lips should keep knowledge. Like, it's understood that you should keep knowledge, right? How did Moses behave with the people? How did Aaron behave with the people for the most part? He did some bad things too, right? How were they behaving? That's how I want you to behave. That's how we should behave, right? Be fearful, but still do it. You know, give yourself to the people. Like, Moses was giving himself so much that his father-in-law had to tell him, look, you got to calm down. You got to, like, appoint some people to help you. You can't help every single person all at once while being the prophet of the Lord. You had to spread this out. You got to set up men over hundreds and over tens and over ones, right? That's the heart we should have, right? You should be working to the point where someone has to come and say, okay, you got to calm down a little bit there on that. Not to the point where you're just doing enough. All right?
Brother Glenn?
Yeah,
I
go
had
ahead.
written this down on what you were saying. It's tremendous that Martin Lloyd-Jones said this in this sermon today that I read. He said a personal relationship, he says righteous living, righteousness lies in a perfect conformity to the law, not the letter, but the spirit. Righteousness, the chief characteristic of the Christian man. And it should be that way with the priest. On what you were saying, exactly with the law on that. He's saying right there a perfect conformity to the law, not the letter, but the spirit. The Jews went after the letter, and it was the spirit. And when you go to Corinthians 3, it's the spirit, it's the heart.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Can someone read Hosea chapter 4, verse 6? And we'll discuss it more, but the lips should keep knowledge. It's the priest's job to keep this knowledge and flowing and letting the people know. And when it breaks down, this is what happens.
Lack of knowledge.
My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, because you have rejected knowledge. I reject you from being a priest to me, and since you have forgotten the law of your God, I also will forget your children.
Good
Amen.
verse.
Thank you. And I'm trying to show you that we're in Malachi, and it's like at the end, and there's some disagreement about which book is actually last, but God is saying this through all the prophets. The priests are failing. You guys are failing. You guys are failing. You guys are failing. And he's saying it's not only that you guys are failing, but what the rest of the people are destroyed because they lack this knowledge.
That's true.
And we're called to be priests, 1 Peter, right? We're called to be priests. And so everything is being destroyed from this knowledge that we have that we can give to everyone else that we're not giving. They're destroyed by it. Now, we don't save anyone, but we're commanded to spread this gospel, this truth, to demonstrate the love of Christ bodily in everything that we do. And we're not doing it. I know I'm not doing it. Can't speak for anyone else, but I know I'm not doing it. All right? So people are destroyed for lack of knowledge, right? It talks about he walked with God in peace and equity. Right? He demonstrated it in his job, which was to be a priest of the Lord. He demonstrated it in how he ate his food and how he talked and how he dealt with his children. I want you guys to think about that we are priests. And this is talking about us and not talking about some people from 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. All right? And if you guys do this, God is saying, this is the people's response. This is the effect it's going to have on the nation and all the people around you in your community. They're going to, verse 6, your actions are going to turn many away from iniquity. Not necessarily save, but it's going to reduce lawlessness. It's going to create a peaceful environment around you. And hopefully it's going to bring many people to fall before the needs of Christ and cry out, to go before God and say, God, something is missing in me because I see this demonstration from the people of God, and I lack this, and I want what they have. This joy or this ability to not lie or not to steal, and how they treat their wives or their husband, or how they treat children. I want that. All right? It also talks about how because they had the word of truth, because iniquity was not found in their lips, because they walk with peace in God, that the people sought the law at their mouth. They came to listen to it. They wanted to hear it. Why are people not going to church? Why are people rejecting God? Besides the fact that they're sinners, is because of the hypocrisy that they're seeing. And a lot of you just mentioned when you talked about the pastors of this time, people who call themselves pastors, but they're so destructive that it's actually pushing people away from coming to hear the word of God. And I want you guys to think, once again, not about someone else, how are you pushing people away from the things of God? How are you making those kind of jokes or behaving in those kind of manners or getting upset over silly things or acting joyless in your life? What makes people say, well, I don't want to be a Christian if every day she's complaining or he's complaining. Right? Think about these things. Right? And it underscores this when he says he's the messenger. His job is to proclaim God, or in our case, to proclaim Christ and him crucified. And so the people are going to be turned away if we are doing what the priests of that time were doing. And we need to get right with God in that respect, right? And that's God's ideal, right? And no one's going to live up to that perfectly except for who? Christ. But this is what the priests are doing, their corruption. Their actual character at this time and throughout history, ever since the Mount Sinai on, is that they have departed out of the way and they've corrupted that covenant. They've forgotten that God saved them from death, and they were the physical representation of God's love, the physical representation of God saying, look, if you offer these people unto me and they worship me purely, all these blessings are upon you. It's like the linchpin of the covenant. So when that's broken, when that's no longer in effect, the covenant is broken. Not because God's law was wrong, but because the people, they didn't make it right. It didn't work properly. So God had to send someone else. God had to set up something new. Something that completely devoided of us. Because if we get involved, it gets all messed up. All right? It says that they have not kept my ways. Right? But like I said to you, guys, you got to remember this. They're still doing the Sabbath. They're doing Yom Kippur. They're doing the 7-year thing. They're doing everything. They're singing. They're doing having conferences. Whatever we do today, they're doing conferences. They're reading the Bible in a year. They're memorizing verses. They're feeding the poor. They're doing all the outward things, but their heart were corrupt. And so their heart was corrupt. God is saying, you have not kept my ways. And they're like, what are you talking about? I have not missed a Sabbath. I give tithes to the poor. I tithe to the church. I give more than I'm supposed to give. Right? I know the Bible back and front. But I have a mistress. But, that's not a big deal. Right? Every time I sin, I go and I do like a sacrifice. God said, I don't want your sacrifice. It's Hosea 6:6. Like I want you to have knowledge of me and you to love me, not for you to just constantly give sacrifices to make up for the fact that you sinned. I don't want it. Don't sin in the first place. This is what he's saying. If you accidentally sin, something happens, amen, come before me and be in humility. But don't just have this besetting sin that you're constantly doing and then go, well, I prayed to God last night about, well, stop doing it. Right? Run from it like Potiphar, like when he ran from Potiphar's wife. Stop doing the pornography or the lust or the lying or the gossip. Just stop it. Get away from it. If you gossip with a particular person, stop talking to them. Like there's ways to stop it. To get away from that. Go to a brother or sister and tell them what you're doing and listen to the advice and follow it. Don't just keep, I keep doing this. Well, you're not doing anything about it. All right? And he said they were partial in the law, that they applied the law in some respects strongly, where they talk about the Sabbath day and what kind of food you could eat, and they were very strong about that. How much work you can do, whether you can walk, how you wash your hands. They were experts. They were the best at those kind of things. But in terms of love and peace and mercy and all the things that God really cares about, they were very lacking in it. Right? And so what does it happen when the priests are corrupt in this way? They didn't think it was corrupt. They thought we were doing everything that we need to do. What happened? It caused many to stumble. The same thing that happens today. Many people thought they were doing right, but they weren't because they were following these priests who were doing wrong. It made people very disrespectful to God because they said, the priests are doing this, it's not real. If their very existence depends on God giving them food, giving them lodging, and protecting them, and they're treating God this way, why should I treat God in any kind of reverence? Right? And it also had the opposite effect. Isn't it funny, like Joel Osteen and these big preachers who have these big churches, they do things to attract more people. But in most people's eyes, they're charlatans and crooks. So he's made them base. That's what it means, contemptible in the eyes of the people. So for their large group of people that are in their church that go and give them money, they're great. Everyone else with any kind of common sense is like, that's a charlatan. There's something wrong with him having a multi-billion-dollar jet and people in his church are poor and destitute. But they think they're wonderful. These priests thought they were doing great things because they were talking to each other and everyone was giving them high fives. But the rest of the people knew this is not what God required, because if they had any scripture, if they knew the Bible, knew what God required. Moses and Aaron, that was the standard. They had a standard to look at, and they were not representing it. That's why during the time of Samuel before, the priest before Samuel, his sons, they knew. People knew. Eli's sons they would put the sacrifice on the I would say grill, because that's what on the altar. That's what they treated like a grill, right? And before it can get really cooked, they would take it off and they would take that home, right? They were disrespectful to God. People knew. They didn't need any special theological knowledge to realize that what these guys were doing were wrong, right? People know. And so that's God's ideal, and what's going to happen is it's the opposite is going to happen. So imagine when you have the Spirit of God in you, what effect you're having with everyone around you. That's what I want you to get from this. It's not about everybody else. It's about you. Read this book and know it's talking about you. And when I'm doing this Bible study, it's not about everyone else around here. It's about me. All right? And it's not pretty. That's why I'm not going into too many details. All right? And I want to show you, I think we have a lot of examples of when it's not right. And I want to show you what, so Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 9 through 10. You guys want to turn there. And I'll end with that, keeping it kind of short tonight. Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 9 through 10. Ezra, Nehemiah, the people of Israel were scattered. They were taken away. And they're struggling. And they haven't heard the law. They haven't lived in Israel and amongst the people of God. And they finally come to a point now where they're back in their kingdom. And the priests are able to function like how a priest should actually function. I don't know, I can't find Nehemiah myself. Could someone read Nehemiah verse 8, 9 through 10? And you're going to see what the effect when a true priest speak, when a true man of God act, true women of God act, what a stark difference it is. These people were taken away. They live in a godless culture, and they've never known anything else. They have the scriptures, but they haven't seen it embodied and exemplified by anyone. And then Nehemiah and Ezra come back at personal cost, at a big risk, leaving cushy jobs and cushy situations to go and rebuild back Israel because they love God so much. And this is what happens to the people when they hear the words of the law read. Can someone read that?
Where is it?
Nehemiah chapter 8, verses 9 through 10.
Then Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra the priest and the scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep." For all the people were weeping when they heard the words of the Lord. Then he said to them, "Go eat of the fat, drink of the sweet, and send portions to him who has nothing prepared, for this day is holy to the Lord. Do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength."
Mm-hmm. So in that situation, they started crying. They weren't crying in sadness, they were crying in joy. Because they never heard the law read before. They didn't know that God had this perfect plan for them. They didn't know that God had worked all these things out. They knew some of the story. They didn't realize what happened during Egypt and how God saved them and why they were doing these Sabbaths and why they were doing all these things and what it meant to have a priest and why the kingdom of Israel was so important. Why synagogue was so important. They're hearing for the first time. Just like we just had the 500 years of Reformation where people were able to read the Bible in their own languages. That's what happens. It explodes. God is able to work. It's exponential what happens. And so I want you guys to think about yourself as being small reformations, small situations of Nehemiah where you're able to give the word to people who've never heard it. There are people in New York City who do not know who Jesus Christ is. Some of them have never heard the name, and if they have no idea what it means. You know how powerful it is for you to tell them, whether they're saved or not saved, for them to know there's a God out there who loves them and cares for them when no one else cares for them. These people are weeping over this. Remember, they're still keeping the Sabbath and they're still doing this, but they haven't had the synagogue experience. They haven't been able to freely worship God, and so when they hear the word of the law read like it's supposed to be read by godly men, they weep, they're crying out, and they're shocked that there's a God that exists that they didn't know about, that cared about them that much. And so what I want you guys to understand is this covenant that they broke, the way that the priests are behaving is so heinous, is so destructive. But if they lived in God's ideal, even if they just tried a little bit, even if they didn't do all the stuff correctly, but they had a really pure heart, the effect that it would have had on the nation of Israel would have been so tremendous, right? And just imagine that Jesus Christ, one sacrifice 2,000 years ago, look at the effect it has on generations of people and all the godly men and the godly women who sacrificed and have been inspired by that one act. And I want you guys to leave here thinking that I can do the same. Not of myself, but just by reading what this says, by memorizing what this says, by living what this says.
Well, to me, when Christ imputed his righteousness to me, that would mean uprightness, that I would want to conform, a conformity, as I said before, to the law of God. It's right living, and that's what you were saying there as far as Nehemiah 8. Now, what happened here was for they being ignorant of God's righteousness and going about to establish their own righteousness. They were always breaking the covenant, and that's what most people do when we speak to them on the streets, you and I, that they don't see this. It's their own righteousness, and that's what the Jews, I want to more or less conform to the law, because this is the man that has been imputed the righteousness and the obedience of Christ, that I want to do this. And this is what a lot of churches aren't teaching, that this church is teaching, right living. And so the study was very, very hopeful on what you had developed.
Amen. Any other thoughts or questions? I know Zion had a question, but took it more. Okay. Anything else? Any thoughts? And then I will end it just reading chapter 3, a couple verses in chapter 3, because it's kind of it's leading somewhere. It's not just talking about the priest alone; it's leading somewhere. Go ahead. Great.
God is speaking against the priests because they weren't living right, and I think we've read about Nahab and Abihu, who were offering strange fire.
Correct.
So they were much more concerned with the outward looking.
Yes.
And that's what's very scary when you think about these false teachers today, or someone who might be in a church for the wrong motive, because God's judgment is on them. They don't know. They're continuing to do the outward stuff. So it doesn't make a difference, who's fooled on the outside, but it's what God sees. And it's very frightening.
Oh, yeah. It's terrifying.
When you see what happened, that God just took them. He just took them.
Yeah. That's why the Lord says, test the spirits to know if they're right. But he also talks about testing yourself to make sure that you're in the faith.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
That's what's scary about it to me, both ways.
Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Thank you. That was really helpful. I'm going to read a little bit, and then we'll end in prayer. So it's leading up to this. Behold, I will send my messenger, a true messenger, right? And he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek, he's talking to people who actually are seeking him, shall suddenly come to his temple, even the messenger of the covenant, whom you delight in. Behold, he shall come, saith the Lord of hosts. And this is the part that's scary. But who may abide in the day of his coming? And who shall stand when he appeareth? For he's like a refiner's fire and like a fuller's soap. And so it's getting to this point where he's saying, what Claudia just said, don't worry about this outward stuff. He's going to come and he's going to be able to tell who's who. And you're going to burn away. He's going to burn the chaff away. He's going to refine those who are false. And he's going to purify those who truly are for him. And so it's terrifying. And so, like I said, do not read these verses. Do not read these scriptures and think about somebody else. And don't think, when it's talking about gossip or something, about this other person. Think about yourself. And I think that will really be helpful for you in your walk. It's very helpful for me in my walk when I don't read this as if it's someone else. All right? He's talking about you. He's talking about you, and you got to really know where you stand with him. And you got to really, really, really wonder how you're living your life and if it's exemplifying him. I don't want you to be legalistic about it. I don't want you to start setting a set of rules, but I want you to really wake up tomorrow morning with a loving joyfulness about what Pastor Peter was talking about in the sermon, about being with Christ. Not the stuff, not the place, not the opposite of hell, but being with Christ wherever Christ is. And if you do that, then you're getting what the point of the book is. Then you're understanding what the whole Old Testament is about. And then reread the Old Testament, and you're looking for the joy and the promise of God. Rob, can you pray us out?